She entered the ballroom as one might step onto a frozen lake, every movement cautious, every breath held against the risk of sudden collapse. Candlelight spilled from towering chandeliers, catching on silk and satin, on polished shoes and jeweled clasps, yet none of it seemed meant for her. She was Miss Eliza Hartwell, 25, quietly born and quietly reduced, invited not in her own right but as a last-minute companion to a distant cousin who had secured her own respectability through marriage. Eliza's gown was modest and carefully chosen, her gloves newly mended, her posture disciplined into dignity, but none of it could disguise the truth whispered behind fans and smiles. She did not belong. Almack's assembly had never pretended to kindness. It was a place where fortunes were weighed in glances and reputations dismissed with a lifted brow. Eliza felt the scrutiny at once, the subtle turning of heads, the murmurs softened by lace and civility. Her family's fall was not fresh enough to shock, yet not old enough to be forgiven. Her father's disgrace, spoken of only in fragments, had stripped them of influence and income alike, leaving Eliza with breeding but no protection. Tonight, she was tolerated, nothing more, a reminder of how swiftly one might descend. She took her place near the wall, hands folded, eyes lowered, schooling her expression into calm acceptance. The orchestra prepared, instruments humming with anticipation, and couples began to assemble in confident clusters. Gentlemen inclined their heads, selecting partners whose names carried comfort and whose futures promised advantage. None approached Eliza. Each passing moment sharpened the humiliation, transforming it from private fear into public fact. To be overlooked at Almack's was not merely discouraging, it was a sentence pronounced without words. Across the room stood a man who seemed carved from a different order of silence. The Duke of Ravenshollow was unmistakable, tall and spare, dressed with restraint that only emphasized his rank. His dark coat bore no unnecessary flourish, his expression no idle warmth. Society did not fear him for cruelty, but for certainty. He was widowed, childless, and politically formidable, a presence in the House of Lords whose opinions were said to end debates rather than stir them. Rumor tied him to the wars abroad, to losses endured without complaint, to a moral severity that left little room for indulgence. He neither sought admiration nor avoided it, he endured it. Eliza had seen him before, at a distance, as one observes a storm on the horizon. Tonight, however, she felt his gaze settle, not lingering but deliberate, as though he were assessing a fact rather than a curiosity. She dared not meet his eyes. Attention, especially of such a man, could be as dangerous as neglect. She fixed her thoughts on the music as the first notes began to rise, the waltz still new enough to draw judgment from older minds, yet fashionable enough to command the room. The couples took their places. Laughter fluttered, skirts swayed, and anticipation rippled outward. Eliza remained where she was. The space beside her widened perceptibly, a quiet mercy granted by those who wished not to embarrass her openly. Heat climbed her throat, and she forced herself to breathe evenly. She would endure this, as she had endured worse. A single evening did not define a life, she told herself, even as she felt herself disappearing within it. Then the Duke moved. It was not abrupt, nor theatrical. He simply turned, handed his glass aside, and began to cross the floor. Conversation faltered in his wake. Eyes followed, fans stilled, and something like disbelief threaded the air. Eliza sensed the shift before she understood it, a pressure, a sudden awareness that the room itself had altered. When she looked up, he stood before her, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corner of his eyes, the discipline held in every angle of his bearing. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice low, precise, and unmistakably public, "may I claim the honor of the first waltz?" For a moment, she could not speak. The words struck like a bell, resonant and impossible to ignore. Around them, silence reigned, heavy with interpretation. This was no idle kindness. A duke did nothing without consequence. To be chosen by him was to be exposed, elevated, endangered all at once. Eliza felt the tremor in her hands and hated it, yet she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze at last. "My lord," she replied, summoning steadiness she scarcely felt, You may. His hand was firm and unhesitating as he led her forward, the simple contact radiating assurance. As they took their place, whispers began to stir, weaving speculation into scandal before the first step was even taken. Eliza was acutely aware of every eye, every judgment being recalculated. The music swelled, and they moved together, her steps careful, his guidance unwavering. For the first time that evening, she was not invisible. As they turned beneath the chandeliers, Eliza sensed that something irrevocable had begun. Whatever the Duke's reasons, he had placed her within his shadow, and society would not soon release its grip. She did not know whether this moment marked her salvation or her undoing, only that the world she had known before the music began no longer existed. Even as the dance carried them onward, Eliza felt the weight of consequence settling like dusk. She understood that protection was never freely given in such rooms, and that gratitude could become obligation with alarming ease. The Duke's expression revealed nothing, yet his presence altered the balance of power surrounding her, drawing envy from some and suspicion from others. She sensed that invitations might follow, along with scrutiny far sharper than neglect. When the final notes approached, her pulse quickened, for she knew the end of the waltz would not end the moment itself. It would merely begin the reckoning that waited beyond the music. Fate, once stirred, rarely returns quietly to its former stillness. When the music ended, the applause arrived late, as though the room required permission to breathe again. Eliza felt the Duke's hand release hers with deliberate courtesy, neither lingering nor abrupt, yet the absence of his touch left her oddly unmoored. Around them, conversation resumed in cautious fragments, voices lowered, meanings sharpened. She sensed herself transformed from an overlooked companion into an object of intense speculation, her name passing from mouth to mouth with newly dangerous curiosity. The Duke inclined his head, escorting her back to the edge of the floor, his composure unchanged, as if he had merely fulfilled an expected duty rather than defied the unspoken order of the room. "You danced admirably," he said, quietly enough that only she might hear, yet clearly enough to suggest intention rather than secrecy. Praise from such a man carried weight, and Eliza felt it settle upon her shoulders with unfamiliar warmth. "You are generous, my lord," she replied, choosing gratitude over caution, though she suspected the distinction would matter little to those watching. He studied her for a brief moment, his gaze assessing not her gown or her prospects, but the steadiness of her regard. "Generosity," he said, "is too often confused with honesty." With that, he stepped away, returning to the periphery of the room as though nothing remarkable had occurred. Remarkable, however, was precisely what followed. Invitations that had been withheld now hovered, uncertain and testing. A matron offered a polite nod where before there had been none. A young lady whispered behind her glove, glancing at Eliza with thinly veiled interest. The protection implied by the Duke's choice lingered like a crest upon her brow, invisible yet undeniable. Eliza accepted no further dances, sensing instinctively that excess would cheapen what had already unsettled the evening. She remained composed, listening, observing, absorbing the altered currents around her. By the time her cousin announced their departure, the air felt heavy with unresolved questions. Eliza left Almack's beneath the steady gaze of the patronesses, aware that she had been weighed anew and found, if not approved, then no longer dismissible. Outside, the night greeted her with cool restraint, the clatter of carriages echoing against stone. As she stepped into the waiting conveyance, she allowed herself a single unguarded breath, releasing the tension she had carried since entering those doors. She did not expect the Duke to follow. Yet moments before the carriage departed, a footman paused, and the Duke of Ravenshollow appeared once more, his figure outlined by lamplight. He addressed Eliza's cousin with impeccable politeness, requesting a brief word. The exchange was swift, discreet, and decisive. Eliza felt the carriage settle again as he took a seat opposite her, the space suddenly charged with significance. "I trust you reached home without difficulty," he said, as the carriage resumed its course, his tone suggesting continuity rather than intrusion. "We have only just begun the journey, my lord," Eliza answered, startled despite herself. "Then I shall be brief," he replied. "Tonight's choice will invite conjecture. I would prefer it guided rather than left to misinterpretation. Her pulse quickened. And how do you propose to guide it? By consistency, he said. I will call upon your cousin tomorrow afternoon, as propriety demands. I advise you to be at home. The words were not a request. Eliza felt both relief and alarm intertwine. Society will draw its own conclusions, she said carefully. They always do. Indeed, he agreed. Which is why silence is rarely the safer course. His gaze held hers, intent and searching. You may withdraw, if you wish. I would not compel you into discomfort. The offer, measured and sincere, surprised her. Withdrawal had been her habit, her shield. Yet she recalled the moment he had crossed the ballroom, the certainty of his step, the courage it had lent her. I will not withdraw, she said. Not now. Something like approval flickered across his features. Very well. The carriage slowed as it reached her cousin's residence. He rose, opening the door himself before stepping down. For a moment he paused, his expression grave. Miss Hartwell, he said, there are truths you do not yet know, and consequences I cannot entirely prevent. If you choose this path, it will not be without cost. Eliza met his warning with quiet resolve. My lord, my life has already been shaped by costs I did not choose. I would rather face those I understand. He inclined his head, a gesture that carried respect rather than dismissal. Then, until tomorrow. That night, sleep eluded her. Her thoughts returned again and again to the waltz, to the deliberate gravity of his words, to the sudden expansion of her world's boundaries. By morning, rumors had already begun to circulate, carried on servants' tongues and breakfast tables. Some spoke of charity, others of intrigue, a few of ambition. Eliza dressed with care, aware that her appearance would now be scrutinized for signs of presumption or gratitude. She chose simplicity, determined that nothing about her should suggest triumph. The Duke arrived precisely as promised. His visit was brief, formal, and devastating in its effect. He spoke little, yet his presence alone confirmed what society had suspected. By afternoon's end, Eliza understood that the waltz had been only the beginning, a single step in a dance whose pattern was still unfolding. As the door closed behind him, she felt both steadied and unsettled, knowing that restraint, once broken, could never be entirely restored. She stood by the window long after his departure, watching the street as if it might yield further instruction. The certainty she had felt now mingled with apprehension, for attention was a currency that demanded payment. Yet beneath her unease stirred a fragile resolve. Whatever followed would be faced awake, not shrinking. Somewhere beyond the murmurs and judgments, a future had shifted, and though its shape remained uncertain, Eliza sensed she had already crossed the threshold from which retreat was no longer possible without surrender or silent regret. The Duke's second visit came without ceremony, announced neither by carriage spectacle nor by advance notice, as though he wished to test whether intention alone could command attention. Eliza was seated in the small morning room when the footman delivered his card, her hands still from their work, her mind already alert. She had thought herself prepared, yet when he entered, the quiet gravity of his presence unsettled her more than the ballroom ever had. Here there were no chandeliers, no orchestra to mediate silence, only the measured ticking of the clock and the soft light filtering through lace curtains. I thank you for receiving me again, Miss Hartwell, he said, inclining his head with the same formal restraint he showed the world. You honor us by returning, my lord, she replied, rising to meet him, her voice steady despite the awareness that this meeting, too, would be observed and judged. They sat opposite one another, the distance carefully maintained. For a moment, neither spoke. The Duke's gaze moved briefly about the room, noting its modesty, the absence of excess, before returning to her face. I prefer clarity, he said at last. It spares us both the cruelty of assumption. Eliza folded her hands, sensing the weight of what he intended. Then we are of one mind. He nodded. My choice at Almack's was not impulsive, nor was it an act of charity. I do nothing lightly, Miss Hartwell, least of all in public. I never believed otherwise, she said. Which is why I did not thank you for rescuing me. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched his mouth. Good. I would not have accepted it. The moment eased something between them, allowing truth to advance where ceremony could not. He spoke then of his wife, briefly and without indulgence, of a marriage forged in duty and matured into respect. Her death, he said, had taught him the cost of silence and the danger of living only as expected. Eliza listened without interruption, aware that such candor was a rare offering, not to be met with pity. When I returned from the war, he continued, I found society unchanged, eager to resume its diversions. I did not share its appetite. I withdrew where I could, intervened where I must. His gaze sharpened. I have no desire to rescue you, Miss Hartwell. But I will not pretend ignorance when injustice is paraded as tradition. Her breath caught. You speak as though my circumstances were known to you. They are, he said. Your father's disgrace was exaggerated for convenience. He was made an example to soothe greater offenders. He paused. I was among those who remained silent. The confession struck deeper than accusation. Eliza felt the old shame stir, tempered now by a strange relief. Then you understand why I cannot seek protection lightly, she said. Nor accept it without cost. I do, he replied. Which is why I offer neither protection nor promise. Only intention. The word lingered, heavy with implication. Eliza rose, moving toward the window as if distance might clarify thought. Intention, she repeated. Toward what end? He joined her, standing not beside but slightly behind, granting her space even now. Toward truth, he said. Toward restoring what was unjustly taken, if it can be restored. Toward you, if you permit it. She turned then, meeting his eyes fully. And if I do not? Then I will step back, he answered simply. But I will not deny what has already been set in motion. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels rattling against stone, a reminder that the world continued regardless of private reckonings. Eliza considered the life she had lived in retreat, the careful invisibility she had cultivated to survive. I cannot offer you gratitude, she said slowly. Nor compliance. Only honesty. Then we are agreed, he said. The understanding settled between them, fragile yet resolute. When he departed, there was no dramatic farewell, only the quiet sense that something essential had been named. Eliza remained by the window long after, her reflection faint in the glass, altered not by circumstance alone but by choice. She knew the path ahead would invite scrutiny sharper than before, resistance cloaked in civility. Yet beneath the apprehension stirred a steadier emotion, one she scarcely dared to claim. She had been seen, not as an object of rescue or rumor, but as a woman whose dignity commanded response. Whatever followed would test that recognition, but for the first time she felt equal to the trial awaiting her. The following evening returned Eliza to the public gaze, though she entered it with a steadier carriage than before. The assembly was smaller, more selective, yet no less vigilant, its attendees keen to witness whether rumor would crystallize into declaration or collapse into embarrassment. Eliza sensed the scrutiny immediately, felt it press against her shoulders as she took her place among familiar faces now sharpened by expectation. She neither sought the Duke nor avoided him, holding herself with the quiet resolve born of recent truth. He arrived without flourish, acknowledged with deference that bordered on relief by those who valued certainty above kindness. When his eyes found hers, there was no surprise in them, only recognition. The orchestra paused between sets, conversation rising to fill the space, and Eliza understood that whatever was to occur would do so in full view. Retreat now would read as confession. Advancement would demand courage she was only beginning to trust. The Duke crossed the room once more, yet this time his purpose was unmistakable. He did not offer his arm for a dance. Instead, he addressed the patronesses first, his manner precise, his words pitched for hearing without display. Eliza could not catch every phrase, but she saw the effect as surely as if she had. Brows lifted. Fans stilled. Authority, when exercised calmly, required no embellishment. He turned then to her, extending his hand. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "may I have the honor of presenting you to those who govern this assembly?" The request was audacious in its simplicity. Eliza placed her hand in his, aware that the gesture itself carried declaration enough. As they approached the gathered arbiters of society, she felt the tremor of consequence ripple outward. The Duke spoke of character rather than lineage, of integrity proven under strain, of the danger in mistaking silence for guilt. He named no names, leveled no accusations, yet the truth moved unmistakably among them. Eliza stood beside him, neither shielded nor diminished, her presence itself a testament. When one patroness at last inclined her head, the movement was slight but irrevocable. Permission, once granted, altered the landscape. Conversation resumed, tentative at first, then with increasing ease, as though society had been granted leave to accept what it had already witnessed. The Duke released her hand only when acknowledgment had been secured. "You are restored," he said quietly, not as a boast but a statement of fact. She met his gaze, emotion tightening her throat. "By your will. By your constancy," he corrected. They walked then through the remainder of the evening together, not in isolation but in shared visibility, answering inquiries with measured grace. Eliza felt the old fear recede, replaced by a cautious confidence grounded not in favor but in self-possession. When the final carriage departed and the candles burned low, the Duke paused beside her. "My intentions are unchanged," he said. "I would have them known." She did not hesitate. "Then let them be guided by truth." He bowed, the gesture formal yet intimate. As he withdrew, Eliza remained standing, aware that the night had closed one chapter and opened another. She felt no triumph, only balance restored. The assembly dispersed, leaving behind a quiet certainty that what had been publicly claimed could not easily be undone. Yet as she gathered her shawl and stepped into the cool night air, Eliza understood that restoration was not conclusion, only permission to choose with eyes open. The Duke's declaration had steadied her place, but it had also bound her future to a man whose principles were as unyielding as they were rare. She considered the cost of such steadfastness, the loneliness it might demand, and the strength required to stand beside it without shrinking. The carriage waited, its lanterns casting pale halos upon the pavement. As she entered, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, hands folded, heart measured. She thought of her father, of the injustice that had shaped her silence, and of the strange mercy in being seen at last. Not all wounds could be healed, but some could be named, and naming them changed their power. Across the street, the Duke remained where he stood, watching the carriage depart. He did not raise his hand, nor did he turn away at once. Eliza sensed, rather than saw, that his vigilance was not possessive but resolute. He would not retreat from what he had claimed before witnesses, and neither would she. The city moved around them, indifferent to quiet reckonings, yet altered nonetheless by choices made within its rooms. Eliza felt no illusion of ease ahead, no promise of uninterrupted happiness. What she possessed now was agency, hard-won and newly acknowledged. It was enough to begin. As the carriage turned the corner, the lights of the assembly faded, leaving only the steady rhythm of wheels and breath. Eliza closed her eyes, not in escape, but in resolve. The path before her was narrow, edged with judgment and expectation, yet she would walk it awake. Whatever awaited would find her no longer trembling, but prepared to answer consequence with conscience. The night deepened, and with it came the quiet certainty that dignity, once publicly claimed, could not be easily stripped away. She carried that knowledge with her, a steady flame against the dark, sufficient to light the uncertain miles ahead. But even as resolve settled, anticipation stirred, for declaration invited response, and truth, once spoken, demanded reckoning. Eliza knew that acceptance was fragile, contingent upon continued courage. The Duke had stood beside her once, and in doing so had altered her fate. Whether he would stand again, when consequence sharpened, remained unproven. The future gathered, patient and watchful, and Eliza, at last, felt equal to meeting it, whatever shape it chose. She did not know what name to give the feeling that filled her, only that it was stronger than fear, quieter than hope, and enduring enough to carry her forward. The carriage disappeared into the lamp-lit streets, bearing it home.